Right, hello and welcome back to another video. So in this video I'm happy to confirm I have completed all of the video lessons to go with the materials course that I showed you last time. As a reminder, the course is split into two parts. First part working as a sort of holistic overview of the material editor, covering everything from material blend modes, shading models, all of the different math operators and nodes you can use within the material editor, looking at input data, how we can get information from other parts of the engine into our materials, and then finally a deep dive into UVs and what they do and how we can manipulate them to do all sorts of effects. And then finally an overview of some of the engine functions and also a load of custom functions that get made as part of the course. That's part one. Part two is a deep dive into environmental materials, so talking about master materials, instances, and talking a lot about the workflow and best practices, as well as kind of the math and the understanding behind them. Looking at decals, or decals, depending on how you pronounce it, the different blend modes, and again some of the more advanced things you can do with decals, such as custom response and masking, things like that. Looking at ways we can use world space and directional inputs to create variation, so projections and randomness, things like that. Then a deep dive into vertex painting, lots of options and ways that we can use vertex color to blend between different material types. Some landscapes. It's going to take a second to open that one. A lot of materials in here, but again a deep dive into landscapes, so different blend modes for landscapes, different ways of creating landscape layers, ways of doing adjustment layers, all of that kind of stuff. And then finally using runtime virtual textures to do blending into the landscapes. We have a look at auto landscapes, so a debug version here on the left and a fully textured version on the right. And then finally a little look at layered materials and how we can set up materials to use the new layered system, so layer blending between different layers. And there we are. As a sample, I'm going to include two videos, one from the first half and one from the second, both talking about ways of adding contrast to textures. I've developed a little extra contrast function that I find really works very well with height maps when we're dealing with blending, and so I'm going to include that and a breakdown of the power node in this video, just as a sample. Big thank you to everyone who's already supported this project and bought the course on Gumroad. That's all been updated with all of these videos, as I say, nearly 15 hours of video content. So hopefully, if you think that's going to be interesting, you can head over to the Gumroad link and check it out. And I will see you all with new tutorials next time. Right, okay, for our next example we're going to be having a look at the power node or exponentials. So I'm using the inbuilt function here, debug scalar values. If you just type in debug, if you spell it correctly, debug scalar values. You can debug float values, you can debug on, off, time sign. There's lots of debug functions built into the engine for us. And you might see here that I have adjusted the values. Oh, number of digits adjusted to 4. So this is going to take our input number and then using a text sample, it's going to convert that into a readable set of numbers. And the default input, if I can find it, lower left, no, maximum number of digits. The maximum number of digits here up on the top is set at 8. Which, if we have a look, is quite a lot of information. So I'm just going to knock that down to 4 and then save, just to make things a bit clearer and easier to read. Obviously, if you are editing the inbuilt engine examples, just be careful what you're doing, make sure you don't break things, but you can always update your engine and get back to the default. But yeah, my personal sort of experience, 8 is far too high. 4 makes much more sense, so I've just adjusted that and then obviously made this note here. Okay, so the power node, if we remember from sort of school, powering something is multiplying something by itself a number of times. So 3 to the power of 2 is 3 times 3. Well, 3 times 3 we know is 9. But if we wanted to do that again, we'd have another multiply and then multiply by itself again. and now we're going to get 27. It gets quite expensive or quite long-winded, and what happens if we don't know how many times we want to multiply by ourselves? What happens if that's a variable? Well, we can't really do that, and so we have this term, or this mathematical operator called power. Let me just clean that up slightly. And so here, 3 to the power of 4, and if I just swap the preview over, that's going to give us the same value. So we're multiplying the number by itself a number of times that we have fixed, and that's what's called the exponential, the exp here. Shortcut for the power node is e-click, e for exponential, and we'll get that multiplication or that operation. Okay, well, that's useful. That's the math behind it, but how is that useful to us as artists? Well, if we have a texture where everything is already a black and white value between 0 and 1, we can use a power command or a power function, power operation, as a contrast. So if I plug in a value of 1, anything multiplied by itself once is itself. So 1 is what I've called the do nothing point. Sometimes with different operations, the do nothing point is sometimes 0, sometimes it's 1. If we're adding, the do nothing is 0. If it's multiplying, the do nothing is 1. If we're powering, the do nothing is going to be 1 again. But if I plug in a value of 2, now we get a bit more dark. The dark areas get darker. 4, 8, and you can see we're adding a lot of contrast to our texture. Similarly, if we want to reduce the contrast, we can use values less than 1. So 0.2, 0.5. It's a little bit less accurate. There's some loss of accuracy in the numbers, but it does work. But contrasting up definitely works quite nicely. Now, why is this happening? Well, if we think about the values and what we have in here, I might just grab this setup. So if I start with a value of 0.1, so I start with a value that's very low and very dark, then the value I'm going to get is going to be really, really small. So small I can't even see it in here because my number of digits is too low. Let's make that 5. That should work. There we go. So if we start with 0.1, a very low value, and we power it by 4, we're going to end up with a really, really, really small value. If we do the same setup, but with a starting value of, let's say, 0.9, something much higher, nearer the whites, when I power that by 4, well, I've still got quite a big number. And so the relative change in the values is different. So the darker an image, or the darker a value starts, the darker a pixel starts, the darker it gets, or the quicker it gets even darker with higher power numbers. And that's why we're getting this contrasting effect. So here, obviously, the darker pixels are these ones in the middle of the cells, and so they are going to get darker quicker, and then the lighter values, the closer to 1, they're going to get darker slower, and so we get more contrast. Note, it's worth noting, anything to the power of anything, well, here we go, 0 to the power of anything will always give us 0, so our black point in our image is always going to be fixed, and similarly 1. So 1 to the power of anything is always going to give us 1. So as long as our input range is fixed between 0 and 1, no matter what we do to power it, we're only changing the middle. This is very similar to levels in Photoshop, if you've used that, or similar histogram scan, I think, in Substance. So we're using this as a sort of way of changing the contrast. Okay. Really useful. Worth noting, it is a little bit more expensive than, say, multiplies. If we were just wanting to add contrast as a one-time operation, you might see this just multiply by itself and then carry on. That would be a slightly cheaper operation than powering. Again, I believe, although don't quote me on this, that Unreal will compile this correctly. So if you're powering by 2, it will work that out and compile down to a multiply. If you're powering by something like 2.25, Unreal can't work that out as a multiply chain, and so we'll have to use a power, but I'm not 100% sure on the compilation of that, but interesting to know. Okay, that's the power node, and next we'll be moving on to some trigonometry and some animation. Right, okay, so here we're going to be having a look at how we can adjust our height maps so they have a little bit more impact, or kind of increase the contrast, not just with the contrast here, the cheap contrast built into the height lerp, but a way of adding contrast that increases the sort of the impact of the height map. So I'm going to do this as a function. I'm going to jump straight into functions and do a new one. Class height, and I'm going to call it offset contrast. So if you've been through the math nodes in the first half of this course, we'll have covered this already, but here we're just going to build it up from scratch, and show how we can add more contrast to things. Okay, well, let's not use a height map first, not use a texture. Instead, we're just going to use a linear gradient. Always nice to look at simple linear gradient when you're doing your kind of like development work, and then you can swap it out and test it with a height map later. But a linear gradient, if we just look at U and then let's do plot function on graph, plug that into f of x. Don't know why that's not the default, that should be at the top. There we are, let's not complain too much. What we're getting here is a simple red line from 0 to 1 along this axis. If you want to change the range, make it a bit clearer to see, so it will be from -1, 1, -1, 1, and in y we want 0, and that will be there from the bottom. So you can just change the range of your graph. In fact, I think that should probably be 0, 1, 0, 1, and we'll see we get our lines not quite aligned with the horizontal, the diagonal line here. There's a little bit of edging happening here, but anyway, we can see our red line along our material. It is red. I'm just going to double check my color blindness. It is red. There we go. And we have, not that it matters what color it is, but we have our linear gradient. So this is our UV gradient, which we've seen in previous examples. And we're going to have a look at how we can create contrast or change contrast to this. Again, something we've done before, but always good to revise. So the power node adds contrast, and we can see that. So by adding an exponential, we create this bent or curved line. And effectively our dark values get dark and our light values stay light. But if we start putting in a high value for contrast here, 4, 8 maybe, we've compressed almost all the blacks away, but we've also lost a lot of our whites as well. So only the really bright values are going to be remaining. And quite often height map textures, if I look at this here, they come like this. They come with black and white values, but they're quite grayscale range. And so we might want to have some very heavy contrast to that. But if we do that, what we'll get is basically all the values disappearing. So that doesn't really work for this case. But it is a way of adding contrast, and we do use it all the time. But I find with height maps, it tends to not work. Obviously, contrasts less than 1 push the values the other way and increase the ratio to have more lower values, but not useful here either. So cheap contrast is the other option that comes with the engine. And if we keep contrast a value, let's plug in a value here. Value of 0 does nothing. Value of over 1, what it does is it brings in the edges, brings in the range. And that does add more contrast. We've got more blacks, more whites. The greys in the middle are being compressed. And this is useful for doing blending between things sometimes. And this is the current contrast setup we have. If we go really high, it'll go just to like pure black and pure white. But the disadvantage with this is we're now basically getting a really hard transition. We've lost any of that information between that kind of grayscale middle. And so now things can start looking quite hard edged. And it's also moved around the midpoint or move to the midpoint. And so we want something similar to this, but rather than being at the kind of midpoint section, I'm going to do it and basically compress our texture up so that the blacks get removed and then the white values stay white. And that's what I've called offset contrast, which I find is really useful for dealing with height maps. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to add an offset value. So I'm going to take my gradient and I'm going to subtract what I call an offset. And we'll change this to be an input later on because we're in a function. But for now, we're going to offset a value. And if I have a look at the output, if I start offsetting by 0.1, well, I've moved my values here to be negative. If I offset by 0.25, again, bringing these values down, but I'm affecting both sides of my range. What I want to do is now I've done the offset, rescale my graph so that this value here ends up here. And the way I'm going to do that is by taking the same offset value and calculating what percentage I need to move up by. And I'm going to do this for 0.5, and that's going to sort of allow me to work out the maths easily. And so hopefully can get to where I want to be. So subtracted 0.5, so this is now at half. To get from a half up to here, I need to multiply by 2. Let's put in a value and just plug it in. So when I have a value of 0.5 as my input, I need a value of 2 as my output, and that's giving us the result that we want. Okay, if I try 0.25, well, now multiplying by 2 is too much. What I need to multiply by is going to be, well, 2 is too much, 1 is too little, 1.5, not quite, 1.35, 1.4, something like that. And that's the thing I want. And we'll write this down, and we're going to work out a relationship between our input values and our output values. I think that's approximate rather than exact. Let's try another one, 0.75. Well, now I want to take this is at 0.75, I've taken that 0.25, I need to multiply by 4, and that's going to give us up here the value that we want. So 0.75 and 4. Okay, so looking at these values and doing a little bit of sort of detective math, I can work out what we want to do is we want to take 1 away from our offset value. So if we're at 0.75, we need to multiply by 4. Well, what's the relationship between those? Well, 1 minus 0.75 is 0.25, and then 1 divided by 0.25 is 4. So it's 1 minus our input, and then 1 divided by our input. And that gives us the right result. So if we take that for 0.5, well, if we're subtracting a half, we want to double. Well, in this case, we could have just done 1 minus. So that would work for that case there. But for 0.25, well, if we're subtracting a half or subtracting 0.25 to bring it down, we then need to multiply it by approximately, I think it's 1.33 actually. Well, 1 over that is 0.75, 1 divided by 0.75, that gives us 1.33. So this gives us the correct ratio for all values of offset input to give us a white point that never moves and a black point that gets pushed down. And this works very well for height maps, as I say. Obviously values over 1 are just going to be invisible because we've subtracted 1 from everything. But values between 0 and 1 give us this moving bottom point by sort of moving the black layer, which works really nicely. We have a look at that on a texture. The ORD textures have height maps in them. Rocky forest floor, D. I don't want to plot that as a function, I just want to see it. Here we have our rocky forest floor height map, and as I start to bring in the offset, you can see the darker areas get dark and the higher areas stay light. And so this kind of replicates that idea of a surface sort of filling up with water, which is kind of what we want to do when we're doing height map blending. We want to kind of fill from one side up. And so adding a bit of this kind of offset contrast to our material, or to our height map before we sample it in the height lerp, will give us a lot of control over how much sort of impact the height map is having. Okay, hopefully that makes sense in terms of sort of the math behind it. Just going to clean this up and set this up as a function. So this is our little math part of it. I'm going to change our offset to be an input. Call it offset. It is of type scalar. Preview value. Preview value of 0 sounds good. Preview value not doing anything. And we're going to subtract that from another input, which is of type texture. Texture 2D. Oh, that's not right. Is a texture sample. There we go. And the texture sample has the input texture 2D. And we'll set this to be preview value. And we'll just set the preview to be actually, tell a lie, let's not do it that way. Let's do our texture input outside of our function. And so what we want to subtract here is our gradient function input. Gradient of type scalar and preview value. Not going to preview as 1, I'm going to preview using a linear gradient. And there we are. So by default, it will load in a quick UV gradient and subtract from it. And then that will be our output. Now, one thing we haven't done yet is we want to clamp this just so any negative values are taken away. So we're subtracting at the start, and so we were having values down here, but we never really want to get negative values to do blending with, and so just saturating it keeps those values between 0 and 1. Okay, and that is our offset gradient, or offset contrast. Gradient input, offset input, and we can save that out and use that as a function in our materials.